So we're going to begin to talk about science basics in this lecture, and this is really foundational for how you think about the whole content of this course. So before we start with that, I want to make a little note on taking notes. So maybe each of you can relate to this young woman in the screen. You can see she's probably watching her instructor's lecture and she's not present. And this happened to me a lot when I took an online class in psychophysiology. I just found it a lot harder to engage when the instructor was just on video, even though he was a really good instructor and he was actually teaching a class, recording an actual class he was teaching. And usually I don't have trouble concentrating, so I'm really aware of this problem. So here's how I solved it and how the research supports. So you already know by now that just looking at these slides does not help your learning. To learn, we have to be active and engaged with the content, and one way to do it is to write things down. But copying things down verbatim, word for word, like if you write down everything you see on this slide, it's still not going to help your learning. What you have to do is use an active process of paraphrasing. So whatever you hear and see, you have to write it down in your own words, in your own structure, with your own diagrams and images. You have to put your own take on it in order for it to be meaningful. If you copy it directly, it's passive. You won't learn anything. And one more thing. If you think you might take notes on a computer, you'll find that actually research supports that taking notes by hand is much more effective, because the motor skills involved in writing by hand involve lower parts of the brain and therefore promote better learning. Your brain is more engaged. And also, when you do it by hand, you're going to set the page up in some unique way, and that will give you a better image for visual recall, a better way for you to remember your notes. So I just wanted to begin this lecture with that particular recommendation for all of you. We talked quite a bit in the last lecture about sources of knowledge, and just a little lighthearted idea toward this. We can see here that where do we learn about our vaccines? And here we can see a scientist in a laboratory clearly testing with actual data, lots of vials, using actual data and careful procedures to draw a conclusion, as opposed to what most of us consider research, which is, haphazard scrolling on the phone. So just reviewing the sources of knowledge, if you're quite familiar, you can move forward. But authority, someone said it, or I saw it online, or I heard it from a trusted friend, so it must be right. Tradition, a type of authority, it's always been done this way, so it must be right. Personal observation, empiricism, I saw it with my own eyes, so it must be right. Intuition, I have a gut feeling about it, and I always trust my gut, so it must be right. Rationalism, I thought it through and it just makes sense, so it must be right. Versus what we're talking about today, the scientific method, which we're calling systematic empiricism. Careful researchers systematically collected and evaluating objective evidence. Objective meaning it's the same no matter who looks at it. So the problems with those other sources, when we rely on authority, well, they might have ulterior motives, or the authorities might have a lot of charisma but lack training and knowledge. Traditions might be right in one time and one place, but not in another time and another place. Or they might just plain be wrong. Or they might just plain be right. But that doesn't yield objective scientific findings. Personal observations, our interpretations of what we have seen might be incorrect, like if we perceive a satellite as a UFO. Intuition emerges from emotion, and emotion may be wrong, such as jumping at the sight of a stick that looked for a moment like a snake. And rationalism, well, the premises may be wrong. For instance, all cats have fur, that's a false premise. Or the conclusion may be wrong. And that is to say, we had flawed means of finding our conclusion. And so our scientific method, sometimes it can't be applied. Like God exists, we cannot, at this stage of science, use a scientific method to find out. Sometimes we can't find a way to test something, and science only answers the questions that we ask. But nevertheless, science does yield generally findings that can be depended upon in the extent to which they answer the asked question. So the features of science, and this is from your book, so I'll highlight these for you. First, if it's science, it is systematic empiricism. And empiricism, as you know, means observation. But it's not just I saw it. It's that it is observable no matter who sees it is seeing the same things, and I've gathered systematic data to demonstrate that. So that's a little bit different than just I saw it or even we saw it, because it's an objective way of gathering objective data. Science answers empirical questions. It answers questions about the way the world actually is, not the way it should be, the way it ought to be, not the way we want it to be. And so because we're answering questions about what actually is, we can answer them, test them, and gather systematic data. And two details about empirical questions: they're falsifiable, and that means that there would be a way to prove that the answer is no. So if we make a statement, there would be a way to show that the statement is false. We'll look at some examples later. And secondly, empirical questions don't have values. They don't prescribe or say what should be done. They just present what has been observed. And finally, public knowledge. So science is careful about its findings. It makes careful, limited claims based on clear methods that have been reviewed by other scientists, not big, expansive claims with undetectable evidence. So most things that are claiming to be cure-alls are not science. And most things that have a big, flashy marketing scheme are not based on science, because science is prudent and limits the findings to what can be clearly concluded from the data. While some scientific claims are eventually find its way to the public news media, the starting point is always peer-reviewed publications, so scientific journals, before any kind of publication in general, and never sensational headlines that are trying to get your attention. And so if it's not science, it's probably pseudoscience. And what is pseudoscience? Well, going down here before we read the definition, it looks like science, but it isn't. Pseudoscience is a set of beliefs or activities that can be pseudoscientific if its adherents claim or imply that it's scientific, but it lacks one or more of the three features of science. So not all pseudoscience claims are false, they just can't be demonstrated scientifically. So here's an example of pseudoscience. Dr. Magic's miracle cure, the quick fix secret they don't want you to know about. I know it works, I tried it and I feel better. 100% guaranteed, 100% organic, certified. Hope in a bottle, nature's wellness, holistic healing, ancient wisdom. 100% natural and safe, no side effects, used by millions for centuries. They're making all kinds of claims here to persuade you. Optimizes your health, works at the cellular level. That sounds scientific, doesn't it? Treats the whole person, addresses the root cause, restores bioenergy frequencies. What's bioenergy? Right? There's another word that could be scientific. So it's trying to look like science, but it isn't. So it's making really big claims in the public without a scientific foundation. So this is when the problem comes up. When pseudoscience pretends to be science, it creates false understandings. That's where kind of lies emerge. So since pseudoscience lacks empirical questions, we remember empirical questions must be falsifiable. So I say questions here. I think we could say empirical statements as well. And so falsifiable means that there would have to be a way to provide evidence against the claim. So the first statement is falsifiable. The statement is women talk more than men. So we don't know if this is true, but we could demonstrate. We could find out, couldn't we? We could say take males and females, put them in an identical situation and count how many words the men spoke and how many words the women spoke, and then compare those numbers using a statistical test. It's falsifiable. How about the second claim? The second claim is not falsifiable. And the claim is ESP exists. ESP, extrasensory perception, is like mind reading. So you might say we could test this and prove that it doesn't exist. So we show someone a deck of cards and we pull a card and we say, what card am I holding, without showing them the card. And the person gets it wrong. So we could say, okay, that means it's falsifiable. We just proved that it wasn't true. But the people who have ESP make claims that their ability disappears when it's scrutinized. And that doesn't mean it's true, it doesn't mean it's false, it just means that it's not falsifiable. There's not a way to prove that it doesn't exist. And so it's not a scientific empirical question. Secondly, it doesn't make value judgments. Never has should or ought to questions. Those are never empirical. So this question, should children respect their parents? Well, we might all think, of course, yes, but that's not an empirical question because it implies a value statement. Science, could make a conclusion about, say, children who respect their parents being healthier or claims like that. But this value judgment, what people should do, that's not part of science. Science can only observe what is, not declare what should be. So an empirical question that doesn't have a value judgment but gets at the same topic is, do authoritative parent-child relationships lead to fewer behavior problems during the teen years? And so this would not have a value judgment. It's just trying to observe behavior problems in response to parenting. So we could ask, are the following questions empirical? So we would ask ourselves, is it possible to develop a test of the question that is objective and could yield yes or no answers? If yes, then maybe it's empirical. And then we want to check, does the question use words like should or ought to? If they do, then it's definitely not empirical because science doesn't have shoulds. So question 1, should parents allow children to have free use of screen time? This is not an empirical question, and we know it because there's this should, this value judgment. If we were going to turn this into a scientific question, we might say, look at the number of behavior problems in children who have free use of screen time compared with those who don't. But we don't put this value judgment on it. Second question, is there a relationship between screen time and social skill? So I would say this is an empirical question because I think we could develop a test that would yield a yes or no answer. We could say, take a group of children and keep track of their screen time and keep track of their social skill, measure it in some way so that we have numbers attached to both. And then we could run a correlation and see, answer yes or no, is there a significant relationship? Third question, does talking about bad things in the home cause them to happen, make them happen? I think that this would not be a scientific question, at least not the way it is right here, because there's not a way to answer no to this question with evidence. If bad things happen, we couldn't directly go back and link them to things that are talked about in the home, or we couldn't say, ask a certain number of families to talk about bad things in the home and then see if bad things happen. I don't think this would be an empirical question. Now, if 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 one of you thought this was, and thought you could think of a way to measure and test this, then I could be wrong. How about this number 4? Do angry people attract other angry people? So in other words, if you are angry, do you tend to have in your life more angry people? This one is debatable. It doesn't have any shoulds, so we're okay there. We could potentially measure anger in a random sample of people. And then over the course of a week, we could measure anger in all of the people with whom they interact. We could do something like that. There might be a way. It's a question. We'd have to think of a good method of testing this. And then, are teens more likely to listen to adults or peers? I think this is kind of a weak question, but it's possibly could be empirical. We could set up a situation where teens are advised to do something, but the advice comes either from a peer or from an adult, and see whether they're more likely to follow through on the advice given by one or the other. So that's how we evaluate these questions. Finally, the third feature of science, pseudoscience lacks public transparency. To be scientific, it has to build on the scientific knowledge base. So there has to be peer review of methods and conclusion, and transparent exposure of methods, procedures, and conclusions after peer review. So the process through which the conclusion was drawn has to be transparent. So I gave this example here, similar to the previous one. We have another big claim, something they're trying to sell us, Hamlin's Wizard Oil, the great wonder. And it says these blood liver pills are for liver complaint, constipation, disorders of the stomach and digestive organs. So we have these various claims for, but we don't see much about the science here. And it's not likely we could go back and find the scientific process underlying this. So we certainly don't have evidence presented here. We have claims without evidence. And that's what you should look for. What's the evidence when someone tries to sell you something, or for the things you believe? A second component of the scientific method is replicability. That means that the conclusion that we drew through an experiment could be repeated, and a consistent result would be obtained. So if we did the classical music study just described with babies, and we had a result, we would have to design the study such that this could be repeated by another group of scientists, and it would need to be repeated by another group of scientists, and they would need to get the same result. That kind of thing lends more foundation to our claims. So in order for that to work, the study has to be very carefully designed so that cause and effect are cleanly linked, so that there are not other factors involved causing the smartness. The study has to be described in precise detail. Every step of the way has to have exactly a clean description. The methods have to be transparent and available to other scientists, including any prompts, any instructions that the women were given, the way data were collected. All of that has to be available. And the research findings have to be disseminated, so if someone attempts to replicate that study and it doesn't yield evidence supporting the initial claim, it still has to be published. So publishing null findings, it's called, publishing findings that don't support a hypothesis. So this is all about our ability to engage in critical thinking. And when we talk about critical thinking, we're not talking about, we're not talking about criticizing people or judging people or anything like that. So think of a different meaning of the word critical. It just means that we are critiquing, or we are finding the flaws and the strengths of a proposal. And critical thinking involves asking good questions. We'll be doing a lot of that this term. Objectively defining problems, so stepping outside of subjective experiences, stepping outside of our own experience, and objectively, as an outsider, defining it as if we don't have a personal involvement. Examining the evidence available. So we're not going to imagine things. We're going to look and see what's actually before our eyes. We will assess our assumptions and biases, no matter how much we want the results of our study to support our hypothesis. We're going to step back from that and just look at the evidence and not make assumptions that might not be accurate. Avoiding emotional reasoning is part of that. We'll separate facts from opinion. If there's evidence, then we will believe it. If there's evidence of election fraud that is widespread, then we can consider whether this actually occurred. If there's not evidence of widespread election fraud, then we have no reason to presume that it's occurred. Then we might be engaging in emotional reasoning. We'll avoid oversimplifying a problem. Most problems do tend to be complex, and we don't want to overgeneralize our results. We'll consider alternative explanations for our answers. Instead of just assuming A leads to B, we'll consider whether there's any other factor that might explain that relationship. We'll tolerate uncertainty. Uncertainty is uncomfortable, and we have to learn to get comfortable with not knowing, with not having adequate evidence. And we want to maintain skepticism, but remain open-minded. And what do we mean by skepticism? It's not the same as cynicism. Cynicism is always naysaying, doubting anything, just kind of putting down ideas and always rejecting them. Skepticism is questioning things, is realizing we don't know much. We don't know much. So we have to ask questions, and we have to be open to what the answers are. But we're not going to just believe things without knowing either. Now we'll think just for a moment about these two ideas addressed in your text of healthy skepticism and tolerance for uncertainty. So skepticism, it just means that you don't believe everything you hear. And so healthy skepticism is just being open, not being distrustful, but pausing to consider alternatives and to search for empirical evidence. The second bullet says, not negative or distrustful, but good scientists are aware that they too are vulnerable to intuitive or logical errors. And this word cynical, well, someone who's cynical doesn't believe anything. Someone who's cynical is a naysayer. They're afraid to believe anything. And we can compare that to someone who has blind faith, who believes everything. They're afraid to question anything. Afraid to ask questions about the things that they've always believed to be true. That's blind faith. And skeptics are in the middle. They're not afraid. They're willing to question their own beliefs. So they're not going to stick with something just on blind faith. And they're also not afraid to believe something if they have evidence behind it. So that's what we seek here. We seek for you to become just skeptical. Just willing to investigate what you believe and what you're told to understand the source of those beliefs. And secondly, tolerance for uncertainty. So this is something that scientists need because we very often can't get the answers to our questions. Good scientists will be okay saying, we just don't know yet. We don't have the answer to this question yet. We don't have a way to measure that yet. But the public sometimes prefers definite answers, even if the answers are wrong. So even you in this class might have a question, and the answer that might be necessary is, this isn't yet known. We don't know. And so it's important for you to be tolerant of that uncertainty. That's a scientific thinker, understanding that uncertainty is present.